Back to Butte House right now. I'll be back behind my desk this afternoon making sure that the decisions about our next steps out of the COVID lockdown are the right ones. I said in the campaign that is my priority for as long as it takes to get us through crisis and into recovery. We published during the campaign a very ambitious 100 days programme, and we'll start to implement that immediately. Of course, once the crisis is over, I also said in this election I wanted to give people in Scotland the choice of independence, and I intend to do that when we are out of the crisis.
So when do you start pushing for that referendum?
Well, when we judge the time is right, that will not just be a judgment for me. The Scottish Parliament, which of course now has a majority, a bigger majority of MSPs in favour of an independence referendum than was the case before the election. So the Parliament will judge when the time is right. I indicated in our manifesto that if the COVID conditions allow, I would like that to be in the first half of this parliamentary term. But COVID comes first. The country getting through and out of this crisis comes first. When I said that in the campaign, I meant it, and that's why I'm going straight back to work to continue that job of getting us through this situation.
And in terms of introducing the legislation in Parliament, when could we expect to see that?
Well, again, that will be based on the judgment as to when the time is right. We've got a difficult few months still ahead of us. We're in a good position with COVID. I hope everything is going firmly in the right direction, but we've got to make sure that that continues to be the case and that we get on with the job of delivering that 100 days plan, getting our recovery from COVID underway. The legislation, if a referendum is to be delivered within the first half of this Parliament, which is my preference, COVID permitting, we have to introduce the legislation in a time frame to facilitate that happening. But of course these will be decisions for the whole Parliament once it is back in operation next week.
But that time frame suggests it would be quite soon, towards the end of this year, beginning
I'm
of
not
next.
going to give you a date right now because that would not be consistent with what I've said all the way through this campaign, is that COVID comes first. And I can't tell you with certainty right now when I and the Scottish Parliament will judge that we are sufficiently out of the crisis to do that. But that time frame is the broad one we put in our manifesto, and obviously legislation would have to be introduced in a timescale to facilitate that.
Do you take reassurance from the words from the UK government this morning that they wouldn't be taking the Scottish government to court if it reached that stage?
Well, look, if we end up in court, which is not something I want to see, that would only be because we had a UK government that refused to accept Scottish democracy, and I think that would be an absurd, outrageous and completely unacceptable position for them to be in. I support independence, the UK government oppose independence, that's legitimate, but the only people who have the right to decide that question are the people of Scotland, and the way to do that is in a referendum. So, you know, it's this discussion that often dominates the debate about independence, will the UK government permit a referendum? You know, it's predicated on a lack of basic respect for Scottish democracy. The SNP has just won a landslide election victory on the strength of a commitment to a referendum when the time is right. There is a pro-independence majority in the Scottish Parliament. You know, the statistics of this election campaign in many respects are record-breaking for the SNP. So the question for the UK government is a simple one, and it should not be a controversial one. Do they accept democracy or don't they? And I hope that however they might couch that at this stage, they will accept democracy, because anything else is just completely unacceptable.
The message from them seems to be not never, but not now. So are you in some ways in agreement with them over that?
Well, look, you'd have to ask them that. I hope so. I am saying not now because, as I've just said, I'm getting back to work to continue the work to get us through COVID. But when we're out of the crisis, then people in Scotland have voted for a parliament that says we should have an independence referendum after the crisis in order to shape our long-term recovery. And if the UK government has any respect for Scottish democracy, which they haven't displayed very firmly over the past few years, but if they are prepared now to accept Scottish democracy, it should just be a question of when the Parliament of Scotland, elected democratically on Thursday, decides that the time is right, then just as happened in 2014, there should be an agreement between the UK and the Scottish governments. I hope that is what will happen. And that is the situation that would be consistent with respect for a democratic outcome.
The unionist parties are pointing to the vote share being split pretty much down the middle. What are you making of that argument? Do you still have a case to make to a lot of people?
Yeah, look, having a referendum does not automatically mean that Scotland becomes independent. Scotland will only become independent if if the SNP and the Yes movement can persuade a majority. That, again, is also a fundamental principle of democracy. But this argument, I mean, you've got all these desperate attempts to rewrite the basic rules of democracy. On the strength of the argument that the UK government appears to be rather desperately making, Boris Johnson wouldn't have a mandate to do anything. That is the simple issue at stake here. The SNP won the election. We've won the election with a set of record-breaking achievements. We've got more votes in the constituency ballot in this election than any party in the history of devolution. You'd have to go back, I think, to the 1960s to find a UK party that got a higher percentage or as high a percentage of the vote in a UK general election. The mandate is there. The majority in the Parliament is there. That doesn't mean Scotland automatically becomes independent, but it does mean that it is for the Scottish people to decide. And it strikes me that this argument, Scotland's divided and split on the question of independence, is not an argument against the referendum. It's an argument for allowing that to be determined democratically, because otherwise it's politicians who make that decision, and that is not right.
Other than the letter from the Prime Minister, have you spoken to him at all? Have you planned
I'm due to speak to him later this afternoon. He wrote to me yesterday suggesting a COVID recovery summit. I, of course, will be delighted to take part in that. I'll work constructively with anybody to get us through COVID and into recovery. But longer term, I'm not sure that the kind of recovery that Boris Johnson will envisage is the one that a majority of people in Scotland will support. And that brings to the fore this question: who is it that should shape our long-term recovery and the kind of country Scotland becomes out of that recovery? Should it be Boris Johnson or should it be the people of Scotland?